I read a lot of books, usually somewhere between 40 and 50 every year. And I've always dreamed of a way to keep and connect all of those notes inside of Obsidian. But the real trick is to connect them in such a way that they actually help inspire you when creating something new. So in today's deep dive, I'm gonna walk you through my entire reading workflow, from choosing which books to read, to taking effective notes on those books, to moving things into Obsidian, and then finally building a library from those notes that creates on-demand inspiration for your own creative process. But first, let me show you the payoff, because seeing this will help the rest of everything I'm gonna say make sense. So jumping ahead, here's my booknotes library in Obsidian using the Basis core plugin. It has all my book notes from over 220 books, the author, the year published, the number of pages, my own rating of the book from 1 to 5 stars, and inside each of these book notes, there's a 3-sentence summary, a mind map of the key ideas from the book, and a text-based version of those notes, which contain links to atomic notes mentioned in the book, and uses emoji to create these colored list callouts to make reviewing my notes easier. I know it's a lot. I'm gonna walk through the whole system step by step, but I've got chapters in this video so you can jump to the spot that you want. This video will be a bit longer than normal, so if you just want to see the fancy new Obsidian Basis stuff, you can go straight there if you'd like. And if you want this exact system for yourself, it's all part of my Life HQ Vault, which also contains all my prepackaged productivity and creativity workflows. If you just want the connected book notes, I have something new for you that I'll mention at the end of the video. But the goal here is to explain everything well enough that you could just set up this system for yourself after watching this video. It's basically a reading masterclass with some tech setup at the end. We've got a lot to get through, so let's dive in. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about here is how to never run out of interesting things to read. Now, most of the books that I read tend to be productivity, self-help, or business books, which may not seem all that interesting to some people. But the trick is to stay curious about things and pick books that will help you understand how things work. And if you do that, reading can actually be a lot of fun. The key is choosing what to read, not being told what to read. That happens a lot in school, so people tend to dislike reading, and it becomes harder to pick back up that habit later in life. This happened to me too, but when I started picking books that helped me understand something that I was already interested in better, or possibly contained an answer to a problem that I was facing, it was easy to get through those books. I also found that reading regularly made it easier to create, which is important for me because I used to think that I just wasn't creative. Seems kind of silly now that I've got a YouTube channel, 3 podcasts, a newsletter, and I make my living as an internet creator. But at one point, I was convinced creativity was a genetic trait I just was not born with. And it wasn't until I read Steal Like an Artist by Austin Kleon that I realized nothing's completely original. So when someone creates something, they're simply connecting dots in new and interesting ways. And that's when I realized that if I wanted to get better at creating, I just needed to collect better dots. So for me, that's what reading does. It gives me more and better dots to connect. So when picking something to read, I use 2 specific questions. The first is, what am I curious about right now? And the second is, what is a problem that I'd like to solve? If I can find a book that connects to either, or even better, both of these questions, I am motivated to complete that book, and it's easy to finish. Another tip for finding books to read is to build your anti-library. An anti-library is basically a bunch of books that you haven't read yet. Building an anti-library makes sure that you always have something that's pre-vetted to read when you get done with the book that you are currently reading, and it serves as a reminder of all the things that you don't know yet. So when building my anti-library, I have a simple rule. If someone that I look up to recommends a book, I open up the Amazon app and I instantly buy it. The book shows up the next day and I have something ready to go, so I never run out of interesting things to read. I have built quite a collection over the years following that method. I probably buy 3 or 4 books a month this way, but I consider this to be a very worthwhile investment. Sometimes I don't read these books for years, but then I'll be browsing my bookshelf and that book will jump out to me, so I'll pick it up and read it. You really never know when that inspiration is going to hit, and so having those things at your disposal is important. Okay, so that's how to pick books to read. Next, we need to discuss analog versus digital books. There's a lot of advantages with digital books. I get it. You can bring your whole library with you anywhere you go. They're always accessible. You can sync your highlights easily. Personally though, I always read physical books. I have over 1,600 physical books in my house. And they not only serve as environmental cues to actually read, but they also provide the ultimate distraction-free reading experience. You can't multitask when you're reading a physical book. That's how I got started reading, actually. I brought a physical book with me wherever I went, and then I always had something I could pick up and read a page or two here or there instead of reaching for my phone and scrolling social media. But the best argument for reading physical books that I've come across comes from researcher Marianne Wolf, who has studied this stuff extensively, and she found that screens, even e-readers, encourage skimming, lack a spatial dimension that is useful when sense making, and ultimately cause our brain to feel a little bit like this is fake because the digital page isn't really there. In her book, Reader Come Home, she says that the more that we read digitally, the more our underlying brain circuitry reflects the characteristics of that medium. So if you really want to get the most out of the books that you read, physical books are probably your best bet. Whatever you decide on though, the one thing I would caution you about is using audiobooks. Listening to an audiobook is not the same as reading the words for yourself. The audio just keeps advancing whether you understand it or not. Part of the reading process is struggling with the words. Your brain doesn't engage with the message when it's just on in the background, and it's easy to get distracted by something else that's going on when you're just listening to something. You might be listening intently for a little while, and then all of a sudden 5 minutes go by and you realize you can't recall a single word that the author has said. So this is okay for some types of books, especially fiction, stories, biographies. But if you want the cognitive payoff that comes from wrestling with the big ideas, you have to put in the work. So generally, I would not recommend audiobooks for this type of reading. The exception to this would be if you are listening to the audiobook and reading the book at the same time. This is actually the ideal combination if you really want to mine as much as you possibly can from the books that you read. You get the benefit of hearing the author read the book in their own voice, and it keeps you from jumping ahead in the text. It's a great way to really focus on the words, which results in higher retention of the big ideas that are being discussed. Okay, so next, let's shift our focus to how to read books in a manner where we get the most out of them. One of the most influential books I've ever read was How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler. He was the editor-in-chief for the Encyclopedia Britannica back in the day and a seriously smart dude. How to Read a Book is basically a system for working a book in order to get more out of it. I actually didn't like this book when we originally read it for the Bookworm podcast, but it has forever changed the way that I approach reading, and it's helped me get more out of the books that I read. So over time, I've really come to appreciate the fact that I've read this one. Now, one of the big ideas from this book is that our job as a reader is to receive the message that the author is sending. He uses the analogy of a catcher receiving a pitch from a pitcher. So as the reader, we are the catcher. It is our job to receive the message that the author is sending. And some authors, like some pitchers, have more skill in sending their message, but we still have to do what we can to receive it and understand it correctly. So while reading, we're constantly trying to figure out, what is this book about as a whole? What is being said in detail and how? Is this book true in whole or in part? And the most critical question, what of it? Or what does this mean to me? So to help us figure all that stuff out, Mortimer Adler shares 4 levels of reading that we can use to help make sense of things. The first level is elementary reading, and this is where you simply ask, what does this sentence say? Basic reading. Level 2 is inspectional reading. This is where you figure out, what is this book about? The third level is analytical reading. This is where you ask a bunch of clarifying questions about what the author is actually saying. And then the fourth level is syntopical reading, and this is where you compare the book in relation to the other books that you've read. So once we understand the message the author is sending, the next step is to decide for ourselves, what do we actually think about it? So for example, do we agree or do we disagree with the author? And more importantly, why? The goal is not to be convinced to adopt a system or a framework. You want to figure out what you think about things, collect the bits and pieces that are useful, and then discard everything else. So the key here is not to create the entire book when we're taking notes. That was a mistake that I made at the beginning. I'd read a book like Getting Things Done by David Allen, who is the productivity guy, right? He's the expert, and I would try to capture everything that seemed important. The problem with this is that you end up with a bunch of information that really doesn't make any bit of difference. So personally, I think the purpose of capturing information from the books that you read is to take action on it. And that is reflected in these 3 levels of knowledge, where the first level is information. That's just something that you have. If you just capture things and stick them in a digital filing cabinet or archive, they sit there and they add no value until you have the thought, and then you go dig up that note and you find it in the folder or the place where you put it. And this is what happens with a lot of the potentially life-changing ideas that we encounter in these books. The next level of knowledge is revelation, and this is something that you know. So this is information you can recall without having to go look it up. And being able to recall this is great. This is kind of like being able to recall the answers on the test, but you're not really applying them to your life yet. And that leads us to the third level of knowledge, which is where we really start to get value from things. That is application. So this is where you take action on what you've read, and it's where the rubber really hits the road. The greatest ideas have very little practical value until you take action on them. So with these 3 levels of knowledge in mind, you can see how important it is to not just take notes on what the author tells us we should do. Instead, we want to capture the things that resonate, that pique our curiosity, and inspire us to do something with what we just read. That's the kind of stuff you want to take notes on. In the age of AI, you can always get a summary of what the author wrote. There are even services like Blinkist that try to condense the book down into a couple of big ideas. But those ideas mean nothing unless you put in the work to wrestle with them, which is why I think you have to put in the effort to actually read the book. And you only capture the things that you believe are really useful. Let me give you an example by showing you my own note-taking workflow. So going back to How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler, he proposes a specific way for approaching a physical book that you're going to read. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but basically you're looking at the front cover, the back cover, the table of contents, etc. before you even start to read, so you can start to grok what this book is all about. So I don't follow his format exactly, but I do like the idea of understanding the basic structure before you really dive into things. So that's going to be evident as I get into the tools and methods that I use here in the next section of this video. All right, so when I read, I always read physical books, as I mentioned, and I always take notes using MindNote on my iPhone. It's the best tool I've found for modernizing the process of working a book that Mortimer Adler described when he wrote his book back in the 1940s. Now, you might be wondering why I use my iPhone to take notes when I just talked about how physical books are great because they minimize distraction. The phone is a distraction machine. That's fair, I get it. I've crafted my workflow to optimize for retention and recall of the big ideas that the books contain. So while I believe physical books are best for me in terms of getting the most out of the books that I read, the iPhone is a device I always have with me, and it's the best tool I have for taking notes on those books. The trick is to configure the device to support the intentional workflows I consider to be positive uses of the technology. I've actually done quite a bit to force myself down specific paths whenever I pick up my iPhone. So for example, I use an app called Blank Spaces to eliminate the icons and the badges from my home screen. I only have apps listed here that I consider to be positive uses of my technology. With the way that I've set up my iPhone, I find that once I get some momentum by picking up the physical book and starting to read, the phone really isn't a distraction. Now, before I start reading, I always open up a new mind map and place a cover image from a quick Google search in the middle of the mind map. This isn't completely necessary, but I just like the way that it looks. Next, I look at the table of contents for the book and I recreate that in my mind map structure. If the book has parts, I'll create those as main nodes and the chapters as child nodes underneath. Then, as I read, I capture notes for the things that resonate. I intentionally try to keep my notes simple by focusing on what piques my interest instead of what the author says is important. That way I end up with notes of things that are useful for me instead of trying to copy over everything from the book like I described earlier. I'll also take photos of important diagrams or visuals in the book with my camera on my iPhone and embed those photos in the mind map. So here's an example from the book Tiny Habits by B.J. Fogg, where you can see the graphs that illustrate the key ideas that the author is describing, like the Fogg behavioral model. Having those in the mind map helps me understand the concepts a little bit better. I also have this emoji coding system I use when taking notes that acts kind of like a tagging system. I've been using this for years and it helps me easily locate the good stuff whenever I review my notes. So here's the emoji coding system that I use when I'm taking notes in MindNote. The light bulb icon is for inspiration. This is basically the equivalent of an aha moment or something that is kind of surprising to me as I read. The key emoji is for key arguments. This is the key argument the author is making, which I use to grok the basic message later when I review the mind map. I use the speech bubble for quotes. This is for one-liners that stand out to me when I'm reading, and I make sure to capture the page number so I can roll these up into my quote book note inside of Obsidian. The talking head emoji is for a talking point. This is something I want to discuss when we cover the book for Bookworm, and when I go through my mind map and I locate these emoji, that makes it really easy to create the outlines for those episodes. And then finally, there's the mind blown emoji, where every once in a while I'll come across a section or a statistic that just completely blows my mind. I use this very sparingly, but I do use it once in a while. Now, I could do all this using traditional tags, but they didn't exist in MindNode when I started using this system, and honestly, I just really like the visual nature of this, so I've continued to use this system. They also make it easier to find once I move things over to Obsidian, which you will see in just a little bit. All right, so once I'm done reading, I export my notes from MindNode on my Mac in two specific formats, both of which will end up in Obsidian. The first is a PDF of the mind map, which will get embedded in the note, and the second is a markdown format of that mind map, which gives me a plain text version that I can break into atomic notes and link together inside of my Obsidian Vault. Now, unfortunately, the images don't get exported in that markdown format, but they do exist in the PDF mind map, so I can still see them when I review my notes if I want. Now, jumping over to Obsidian, I have a book notes template file, which has a couple of distinct sections and some specific property metadata. So let's look at the contents of the note first. Each book note has 3 headings. The first one is a 3-sentence summary, where I condense the whole message of the book into 3 sentences at the top of the note. It's always difficult to condense a book down to 3 sentences, but I believe this helps me distill the big ideas. The second is the mind map, which is where I drag in the PDF of my mind map file that gets embedded in the note. I have my Obsidian settings configured to automatically store these inside of my files folder. And then the third heading is notes, and this is where I paste the markdown outline after I copy it from Nova, which is my plain text editor of choice. So once these notes are added, I will go through them and I'll create atomic notes where I deem necessary by selecting text and putting double brackets around it. If it's a concept that appears in more than one book, I'll usually add a call out at the top of these notes with a succinct definition of the concept. And in the lower right corner in the local graph, you can see all of the books that mention this. I also use the List Callouts plugin to add a colored background to every line in my plain text outline that has one of those emoji that I added when taking notes. You can configure this in the plugin settings, but here's what it looks like inside of my notes. Now, most of these are just visual decoration for the note, but I do add some text to some of these as I process the note. So for example, all of my quotes have a purple background, and I will add a tag of #quote to the end of this line and put the author of the quote inside of double brackets so that it links back to the author's note in Obsidian. The #quote is the basis of my quote book note that I explain in this other video here, but basically it just rolls up everything that matches this formatting and it displays it by source. And I also use the Obsidian Task plugin for my task and project management, so I will add a #to-do to all of the lines that have an action item, which is the tag configured in the Obsidian Task Global Filter section. This allows my action items to be rolled up inside of my Obsidian task queries, like on my task dashboard, as you see here. So when I process my book notes, I spend just a couple of minutes going through these text-based notes and adding things like I just described. I also have a bunch of metadata properties that I add at the top of the note. Those get added when the note is created. In the author field, I put a link to the note matching the name of the person who wrote the book, and I do this by putting the person's name inside of double brackets, even if that note doesn't exist yet. If there are multiple authors for a book, I will add both of their names as internal links like this. Next is the rating, which is my personal rating of the book from 1 to 5 stars. I use emoji characters for this, and when I click in the field, it gives me a drop down of all the values that I previously used in this field, like you can see here. So I just select the rating from the drop down list and the rating gets applied to the book note file. Next is the year, which is the year that the book was actually published, the pages, which is how many pages are in the book, and lastly is the cover property, which is an internal link to an image file of the book cover that I have saved to my Obsidian Vault. Now, fortunately, I don't have to do that part manually. In fact, I automate adding most of this metadata using the excellent Book Search plugin. With this plugin installed and enabled, you can run a command, search for the book that you want using the title or the ISBN number, and the plugin can automatically pull in the associated metadata that you choose based on the plugin settings. So here are the settings that I use. For new file location, I always put my book notes inside of my book notes folder. For the new file name, I simply use the title of the book, which can be automatically applied using the title token inside of double curly brackets. Next, I configure the template file location to use my booknotes template file inside of my templates directory. And by the way, my template file is available inside of my Obsidian Starter Vault, so you can download it for free by going to vault.practicalpkm.com. The other important settings here are to show the cover image in the search. This helps me make sure that I select the right book. I turn off the enable cover image edge curl effect option because I just want the book cover when I see it displayed instead of the cards view. I don't want to see the page curling up. I also toggle on enable cover image save, and I've chosen the files directory for the cover image path, but you can put these in a separate folder if you'd like. So now I can invoke the command palette when I want to create a new booknote file in my vault, run the book search create new booknote command, select the book that I want to add from the list, hit enter, and the note is automatically created in the correct folder with the template applied. The cover image is downloaded and added, and the number of pages and the year automatically are updated in the metadata properties. Now, I don't use book search to find the author simply because I want a link to the author's note, and it gets tricky when there are multiple authors. Now, this metadata that we just covered here is important as this is the information that bases will use when creating the cards for all the books in my library. So once that template is applied and everything is set up, I drag in the PDF, I paste in the markdown, and I've got a new booknote now that is added to my library. So I'll go through, I'll add some links, I'll clean up the quotes, I'll create the action items, it takes a couple of minutes, but then it's done. And now it's time for the fun part where we get into configuring this with Obsidian bases. So as I mentioned, I keep all my book ratings in a folder called booknotes. So the library is going to be a single base file, which I've named bookratings.base. And it has a simple filter that only shows files where the file path begins with booknotes. To create the base, invoke the command palette with Command P or Control P on Windows, and select the bases create new base command. This will create a new base file, so click on the name to rename it to something like book ratings, and then click the filter button. The first filter we want to apply to all views, so make sure that you toggle that caret, then under all of the following are true, click to add a filter, and choose where file path starts with booknotes. This will now show all of the files that are in that booknotes folder, plus any that happen to be in subfolders inside of that folder if you have any. The default view will now show a table that looks something like this. All right, so now let's create a new view by clicking on this button in the upper left and choose Add New View. Let's name this view Cards, choose the Cards layout, select Cover as the image property, and for the image fit, I want to choose Contain as this option will display the whole cover file in the card. You can also configure the card size and the image aspect ratio if you want, but that's basically all we need to do. So let's close the settings for this view. So that gives us cards for all the books that we have in our booknotes folder. But we want some additional information to be displayed on these cards. So next, click on the Properties button for this view and check the boxes for all of the properties that you want to display. I've selected file name, which is selected by default and shows the name of the note, as well as rating, author, pages, and year. Each property that you select will instantly be visible in the cards in the view. You can also choose how you want to sort this view if you'd like by clicking on the Sort button. I have mine sorted by file name in ascending alphabetical order. The end result is a beautiful looking card view like this that shows all my booknotes with cover, author, rating, and page numbers. But you can take this even further by creating additional views from that same .base file. So let's click on the view button again and add another cards view named 5-star books. The setting for this view will be the same, but for the filter under the This View option, let's add a filter where the rating property is 5 stars. So now we have a 5-star books view that looks the same, but only shows the books that I've rated 5 stars. And this is one of the things that's really powerful about bases, in my opinion. You can actually create multiple views from the same base. You can slice your information just about any way you want. And from any of these views, you can click on the card to open the note and access all of those booknotes. All right, so there you have it, a complete walkthrough of my entire booknotes workflow from physical books to Obsidian bases. Are there ways that this could be more efficient? Absolutely. But remember, we're optimizing for making more out of our notes and ideas. That requires that we wrestle with these things and we figure out for ourselves what we really think about them. So I'm not just trying to get the information into Obsidian as easily as I can. And I'm also not trying to create a complex system that looks fancy, but doesn't give me any practical value when it's time to make something out of those notes and ideas that I've collected. I have developed and refined this workflow over many years of reading books, and I am constantly trying to optimize my system in order to make the act of creating something new from those dots that I collect easier and more effortless. So there you have it. That is my whole workflow. It may not be exactly how you would do it, but I love this and it helps me to create consistently and never feel stuck or like I don't have something to write about. Now I have another video on a framework that I call the creativity flywheel. If you want to see how I take the seeds of the ideas that I read about in these books and then develop them into original content. There will be a link to that video in the description below this one. I've also linked to all the plugins, the books, and the resources that I mentioned in this video, so you've got everything you need to build this for yourself. And if you want to download my entire library of book notes in Obsidian for yourself, I've actually packaged everything together. You can download it now by going to practicalpkm.com/notes. For a long time, this has been available inside of Life HQ, which is my done for you Obsidian vault. And while I plan to keep it there bundled with all my other workflows, I've had several people ask me if I would create a separate product which just had my book notes in it. The problem is I have no idea what to charge for this. So what I've decided to do is create a pay what you want version of this. This represents a lot of work, so I've set the recommended price at $20, which is less than 10 cents per book. If you happen to be in a position to help me out financially, you want to do that, I would certainly appreciate it. But I've decided not to have a minimum price, so you can actually get it for free if you want, or if you just can't afford it right now, that's cool, I get it, I've been there before. I want to make this as accessible to as many people as I possibly can. So again, you can download it right now if you go to practicalpkm.com/notes. All you have to do is unzip that, open it up as a new vault, you'll have the bases pre-configured and all the notes will be there. I'm also going to start adding the occasional book notes to my Obsidian Starter Vault, which is a great resource if you're just getting started with Obsidian, as it contains a bunch of tips and resources to help you get more out of your notes and ideas. You can find out more about that by going to vault.practicalpkm.com. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in another video.